Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and whenever we think of the Greeks, we think of a single, united, homogenous people, interconnected by culture, language and history, inhabiting the current state of Greece, or Ellada. And yet, one of the most archetypal notions of ancient Greece is that of the poleis, the independent city-states. This may appear as a paradox of sorts. Were the ancient Greeks a single unified people, or were they a collection of people marked by the perimeters of their city-states? A key factor we have to disclose earlier on in this analysis is that while being separate and independent, and lacking the concept of a single Greek nation in the modern sense, the ancient Greeks did consider themselves as one when faced by a common enemy. Yet, as we will see already in the archaic period, an emerging phenomenon of internal relationships appears to have been the true beginning of a synthesis of ethnic and cultural strata. But when did this concept of single Greek identity begin? What was there before? And how did this primal form of collective societal boundary come to be? Aristotle understood the poleis in two ways. One, as specific communities, say for instance Corinth, Athens, Sparta. Two, as a physical location, a city in its structural presence of a human settled community. The second usage in this dual definition is often ignored in modern discourse, while being absolutely present in the ancient texts. Moreover, understanding the spatial dynamics between the genesis of a people's identity and the way they view themselves and the world around them is paramount to unlocking the method of our concept of a people is born. Connect that with the mythic genealogies, and we have the building blocks of our comprehensive analysis. Efforts to define ethnicity frequently rely on the identification of specific criteria believed to constitute an ethnic group. In 1986, Anthony D. Smith proposed a framework comprising 6 such components: a collective designation, a shared historical memory, a distinct cultural repertoire, a sense of group solidarity, a connection to a defined territory, and a common myth of ancestral origin. Building upon this foundation, Jonathan M. Hall argued that territorial association, particularly when coupled with a mythologized genealogy, forms the core of ethnic identity. In contrast, Eric Gruen critiques the entire framework of ethnic criteria. Gruen contends that by refraining from hierarchizing these criteria, Smith sidesteps critical debates regarding which attributes are most essential, and whether these features reflect historical realities or merely serve the ideological aim of national discourse. Regardless of which position you take, it's essential to emphasize that the process of ethnogenesis is both somewhat natural and artificial. Members of an ethnic group do often possess some immutable characteristics, such as common phenotypic traits, some mutable characteristics, such as their core language, but do not always inherently possess fixed distinguishing traits at their genesis. Rather, these tend to gradually develop over time within highly cohesive communities. What this means is that there is a social component which interacts with the biological internal sphere of early tribal networks. At this stage of our analysis, we can say that ethnic identity is often fluid in its primordial genesis, finally crystallizing through a highly dynamic process with multiple variables. Classical Greece emerged from the period known as the Greek Dark Ages, or the Hellenic Middle Ages, which spanned from 1100 BC to 750 BC, following the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. This pivotal historical event is often referred to as the fall of the Mycenaean palaces. As apparent by a careful analysis of available data-based structures, the decline of Mycenaean civilization occurred due to a variety of factors. An investigation of Linear B documents reveals that our current understanding of the societal collapse is riddled with questions and lacking in certainties. However, one thing is clear: the Dorians were not northern invaders or foreigners to Mycenaean society. Instead, they were one of the many ethnic groups comprising its social fabric, alongside the Achaeans, the Minians, the Perebi, the Ionians, the Cretans, and the Lacedaemonians, all of whom are attested in Linear B text. What likely occurred was a vast domino effect that also affected the ancient Near East. Even though modern historiography has tried to eliminate the notion of destabilizing invasions by foreign people, such movements and effects likely did occur, as referenced in Egyptian records concerning the Sea People. However, early historiography exaggerated the impact of these invasions, which had more social repercussions than military or political ones. With the collapse of Mycenaean society, the Greek Dark Ages began, and the various ethnic groups that had already been part of Mycenaean Thessalian Greeks contributed to the emergence of new realities, those of classical Greece. And of course, as one possible example, we have the Phocis. Phocis is one region of Greece that underwent a phenomenon of ethnogenesis. During the Mycenaean period, there seem to have been no palatial centers there, and the local communities appear to have orbited around those in Boeotia. With the onset of the Greek Dark Ages, however, Phocian sanctuaries became important points of reference, even for Boeotian and Thessalian communities. And a distinctive trait of the Greek Dark Ages is precisely the shift of communal focus from palaces to sanctuaries. So, let's focus our attention to these ancient people, the Phocians and the Thessalians. In the famous catalogue of ships in the Iliad, the Phocians are mentioned as an ethnos, but this term should be understood in reference specifically to the inhabitants of Anopius and its immediate surrounding. The term Phocians also appears in the Shield of Heracles, an archaic poem attributed to Hesiod, dated between the 8th and the 6th century BC. In classical text, Phocis is mentioned chiefly in relation to a series of military episodes known as the Sacred Wars, which progressively led to the establishment of a true Phocian koinon, or league, centered around the sanctuary of Delphi. This was an independent entity, a military alliance with sacral overtones. Traditionally, the narrative structure includes 4 sacred wars, although it's unclear whether the first ever truly occurred, or whether it was a literary construct. The second war began when Sparta extended its control over part of central Greece. These were attempts to dominate the Delphic sanctuary, a narrative possibly fabricated by the Athenians. In the Mycenaean era, Thessalian society revolved around the palace at Dimini, but during the Greek Dark Ages, Thessaly appears drawn to the sanctuaries of Phocis. This is supported by the discovery of Thessalian fibulae, or brooches, at the Phocian sanctuaries of Chiampolis and Abae, objects identical to those found at the major Thessalian site of Therae. And within this, a crucial point is the following. Within Thessaly's social fabric, we also find the periodic populations, neighboring people who, once defeated in battle, were incorporated into Thessalian society as subordinates. Their strict class structure resembled that of Sparta, and proper Thessalians resided in the tetrads, or 4 regional divisions. However, Thessaly was a polis perpetually inclined towards expansion, and according to Plutarch, at some point, prior to the Persian Wars, the Thessalians managed to assert control over Phocis. It is important to underline that the army also included units supplied by periodic communities, who were now part of their society. The movement of people, the military conquests, the stratification of society are all early constituents of the genesis of a national identity. Having visualized a few instances of how initially separate ethnos had begun to fuse into cohesive culture-driven population clusters as a generative process, we can now explore the societal roots of this phenomenon and shared criteria. The formative period of the archaic era witnessed the gradual crystallization of distinct civic identities among the emerging Greek city-states. It is during this epoch that the nascent foundations of what would later be recognized as Hellenic identity began to take shape. Initially autonomous in character, these city-states progressively engaged in intercommunal interaction, fostering socio-cultural affinities that laid the groundwork for an eventual collective ethnos. The fabrication of mythical genealogies during this period served dual functions. On one hand, they legitimized territorial claims by invoking descent from heroic ancestors. On the other, they manufactured a shared lineage that later generations of Greeks would retroactively embrace as evidence of ethnic cohesion. This process of identity construction was underpinned by common linguistic usage and the shared observance of religious practices, both of which played integral roles in daily life. These elements, language, cult, and lineage, came to serve as the primary indicia of Hellenic ethnicity. The ancient historian Herodotus, writing in the classical period, systematizes these markers in his narrative of the Persian Wars, presenting a retrospective and idealized notion of the Hellene that had not yet fully materialized in the archaic consciousness. In his histories, Herodotus codifies a form of self-recognition among Greeks, framed primarily through their opposition to the culturally and politically distinct Persians. His portrayal is thus both descriptive and prescriptive. It articulates a self-image while also promoting it. Herodotus' conception of Hellenism is deeply shared by the Athenian intellectual milieu in which he was situated. He elevated notions such as liberty and self-governance, values associated with democratic Athens, as quintessentially Hellenic, implicitly contrasting them with the perceived despotism of the Persian regime. Through a narrative technique that defies the Greek by what he is not, Herodotus constructs an identity matrix rooted in contrast and cultural perceived superiority. In a notable episode from Book 8, Herodotus synthesizes elements of kinship, shared religious observance, and linguistic commonality with shared societal customs. This can be a form to articulate the early template for Greek ethnicity. While it would be anachronistic to claim the existence of a formal pan-Hellenic identity during the archaic period, since extant documentary evidence does not attest such self-conception at the time, the elements that later coalesced into a coherent ethnic identity are already fully perceptible. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. The emergence of a unified Hellenic identity was not a sudden occurrence, but rather the result of a millennium-long evolution, culminating in a construct that bears little resemblance to the fragmented realities of early Greek societies. The term ancient Greek itself is frequently misapplied, suggesting a degree of unity among the diverse communities scattered across the Aegean that did not, in fact, exist in any fixed or absolute form. The various ethni, developed along divergent cultural and political lines, coming together only sporadically and often under exceptional circumstances, are the truer image. Despite the apparent stasis of the preceding centuries, the socio-political landscape of early Iron Age Greece underwent a rapid transformation with the advent of the poleis. The establishment of autonomous city-states afforded communities the space to cultivate unique identities. In time, these discrete developments would give rise to mutual recognition, a realization of shared trajectories that seeded the growth of a broader Hellenic image. By the dawn of the 8th century BC, Greece was emerging from a prolonged period of demographic and cultural regression. The term Hellas, denoting both the geographical expanse and the cultural shape encompassing the southern Balkan Peninsula and adjacent Aegean coastline, housed numerous groups whose internal perceptions mirrored the region's fragmented terrain. Rugged mountains, isolated populations, and coastal dispersion fostered maritime dependency. These conditions encouraged a maritime orientation, making seafaring and access to trade routes key determinants of regional power and prestige. Over time, this gave rise to maritime civilizations that came to include the many Aegean islands within the expanding orbit of Hellenic culture and influence. Preceding the Archaic period, however, much of this same geographic area had been dominated by the Mycenaean civilization, an expansive and sophisticated society that experienced an abrupt population collapse. This decline precipitated the onset of the so-called Dark Age, from which Greece would only emerge in the 8th century. Archaeological evidence, particularly funerary remains, reflect this dramatic demographic shift. Anthony Snodgrass, through grave analysis, identified a substantial increase in burials between 950 and 700 BC, suggesting a population explosion that played a catalytic role in societal regeneration. This demographic rebound did not in isolation inaugurate the Archaic Age, but it fostered environmental and societal conditions conducive to its emergence. The absence of contemporary literary sources aside from epic traditions attributed to Homer and Hesiod renders this period opaque. Nevertheless, material remains such as burial feasts and botanical analyses, such as pollen counts, provide precious insight into subsistent patterns. Evidence suggests a decline in arable agriculture across the 11th to the 9th century BC, consistent with a pastoral economy. By contrast, the early Archaic period sees the reintroduction of crop cultivation, indicating increasing sedentism and the re-establishment of permanent settlements. These agrarian communities gradually developed interconnectivity, facilitating the circulation of practices and ideas. The recovery of arable farming and the ensuing settlement continuity created the preconditions for cultural exchange and eventually the rise of city-state-based civilization. The city-state became the dominant organization unit of ancient Hellas, a political, economic, and religious nucleus surrounded by territory subject to its authority. Civic loyalty and identification with one's polis became central to individual identity and precursor to the collective one. Paradoxically, While the poleis reinforced localism, it also provided a framework through which pan-Hellenic consciousness could emerge. As cities matured in relative isolation, they began to recognize resonant values and practices in neighboring communities, generating a sense of shared heritage. This in turn led to an increasing preoccupation with questions of ethnicity and collective belonging. In a sense, ethnic identity may be seen as one modality within a broader matrix of common identity, denoting perceived bonds of connection and mutual recognition, shared territory, tradition, language, descent, but above all, a sense of peoplehood. Jeremy McInerney argues a sense of ethnicity is meaningless without processes of inclusion and exclusion. Yet, long before Hellenes faced a major foreign other, ethnic consciousness developed primarily through what Jonathan M. Hall describes as the aggregative mode, the core of the thesis lying within the concept of mythopoetic tradition. This ancestral genealogy will be the basis of how the word Hellene will be interwoven, first ground up and solidified through Book 8 of Herodotus' history. To conclude our discussion, a comprehensive assessment of Herodotus' historiographical legacy in antiquity can be elevated through Plutarch's critical reception of his works. A distinguished philosopher, historian and moralist of the early imperial period, in his polemical treatise De Herodoti Malignitate, on the malice of Herodotus, Plutarch offers a scathing indictment of what he perceives as Herodotus' tenditious narrative strategies and ideological partiality. Central to Plutarch's objection is the claim that Herodotus exhibits a discernible pro-Athenian bias, one which manifests in the unjust vilification of other Greek poleis, most notably Thebes and Corinth. In Plutarch's view, Herodotus' historiographical lens privileges the Athenian polis at the expense of a more equitable portrayal of the broader Hellenic world. A particularly illustrative example of this perceived partiality is Herodotus' account of the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the Thebans are depicted as reluctant participants, allegedly held under duress by the Spartans. Yet it is important to recognize that Plutarch's critique, while influential, was not universally accepted in antiquity. Other notable intellectuals of the time, such as Theopompus, Aristarchus, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Lucian, expressed admiration for Herodotus' prose, narrative skill, and ethnographic scope. And with this, we conclude today's analysis. I hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into how the Greek people became one. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.